Mr. Feynman wasn't joking. Why the education system doesn't work, why it can't be reformed, and what must replace it. A New Approach to Education by Dave Delgado. Note to the reader. This is a short book about a problem most people can see and almost no one can solve. Modern schooling often produces impressive performance and fragile understanding, and it keeps doing so decade after decade, despite constant reform. This is not an attack on teachers. Many teachers work heroically inside constraints they did not design, under incentives they cannot control, trying to do something humane inside a machine built for scale and standardization. The deeper target here is structural, the premises and mechanisms that make the system persist even when the outcomes disappoint. Two ideas will guide the analysis: inertia and entropy. Inertia explains why large institutions keep moving in the same direction long after the original justification is gone. The structure, the habits, the credential pipelines, the policies, and the public's expectations all function like stored momentum. Entropy explains why, as bureaucracies grow, the value intended for a child's mind gets dispersed into layers of process, compliance, and overhead unless something actively prevents that dissipation. To keep the argument concrete across subjects, money will appear often, not because money is the purpose, but because money is a practical proxy for energy. Money represents stored human effort, the product of millions of hours of work, collected and allocated in the hope that it will be converted into something precise and personal. An individual child's growing ability to understand reality and think independently. The central claim is that large systems, unless deliberately constrained, dissipate that usable energy into activity that looks organized while producing surprisingly little conceptual growth. Two notes about how to read what follows. The main text is deliberately condensed. The history can get long. The case studies can multiply. The core argument stays in the main chapters. The deeper proof warehouse goes in the appendix, so the story you're reading here can move quickly without constant detours. When the diagnosis gets dark, this book will deliberately open a window. There are escape routes, real ones, not through better slogans or louder reforms, but through a different model of education built around conceptual development and moral guardrails, especially in the age of AI. If you finish this book with one new question, it should be this: are we educating children to think, or merely training them to perform? Prologue. The question nobody could answer. In the early 1950s, a young American physicist walked into a classroom in Rio de Janeiro expecting to teach. Instead, he discovered something more troubling than confusion. The students were not struggling. They were not unprepared. By every conventional measure, they were excellent. They had passed competitive entrance examinations. They could recite definitions flawlessly. They solved textbook problems with impressive speed. On paper, the system was working. Then the physicist asked a simple question. If light reflects off water, in what direction is it polarized? Silence. Not hesitation. Silence. The kind that spreads across a room when something deeper than ignorance has occurred. These were not weak students. Moments earlier, they had correctly recited the formal definition of polarized light, word for word, perfectly. But when asked to connect the definition to reality, to predict what would actually happen in the physical world, not one of them could answer. The physicist was Richard Feynman, and he had just seen a crack in the foundation. The moment of recognition. Feynman did not immediately conclude the students were poorly taught. That would have been the easy explanation. Instead, he did what good physicists do. He tested the system. He tried different questions, different examples, different angles of approach. Each time, the pattern repeated. Students could manipulate symbols. They could reproduce language. They could pass examinations. But they could not use the ideas. To a physicist, this is not a minor defect. It is a systems failure. Because in physics, the purpose of a concept is prediction. If a student cannot use an idea to anticipate what nature will do next, the student does not understand the idea, no matter how impressive the exam score. Feynman had not discovered a classroom problem. He had glimpsed a design problem. The uncomfortable question. It would have been comforting to believe this was a Brazilian anomaly, a local weakness in a developing scientific culture. Feynman didn't buy that comfort. He had seen the same pattern elsewhere. Brazil simply made it easier to see because the machinery of modern schooling was newer and less polished. The deeper possibility was worse. What if the system was producing exactly what it was designed to produce? Students who could perform, but not necessarily think. That possibility is unsettling because it challenges a widely accepted assumption that more schooling reliably produces more understanding. Feynman didn't argue the point abstractly. He looked for mechanisms, and what he observed, first in Brazil, then repeatedly elsewhere, suggested three quiet substitutions that happen inside conventional schooling. Each substitution is subtle. Each looks reasonable in isolation. Together, they are transformative. Three quiet substitutions. First, symbols quietly replace reality. Definitions replace phenomena. Vocabulary replaces observation. A student can say the correct words while the underlying picture remains hazy or absent. To an examiner reading a written response, the performance looks excellent. To nature, it means nothing. Second, authority quietly replaces understanding. In complex societies, we need expertise. But many students, as well as professionals, quietly stop distinguishing between. An authority says this is true, and I understand why this is true. The two are not the same. In science, they cannot be the same. Third, performance quietly replaces curiosity. Children begin with genuine puzzlement. They ask why with relentless persistence. But over time, many experience a motivational drift. The central question shifts from, what is really happening here, to what answer does the evaluator want? This is an efficient way to produce high scores. It is not the same thing as producing independent thinkers. Why this matters now? For much of the 20th century, the gap between performance and understanding was partly masked by the nature of industrial work. Many careers rewarded reliability, procedural competence, and faithful execution of established methods. That world is changing. In an era increasingly shaped by automation and artificial intelligence, the premium shifts toward what is harder to standardize: flexible reasoning, first principles thinking, and the ability to generate insight in unfamiliar situations. Exactly what Feynman was testing for, without saying so. This book is not an indictment of teachers, many of whom work heroically inside tight constraints. Nor is it a claim that schools accomplish nothing of value. It is a narrower and more uncomfortable argument. Certain structural features of the dominant schooling model make it remarkably good at producing compliant high performers and surprisingly inconsistent at cultivating deep, transferable understanding. Feynman saw the symptom early. This book examines the system that produces it, why it resists reform, how AI accelerates its worst tendencies, and what an escape route looks like for those unwilling to outsource a child's mind to a machine built for someone else's convenience. The question that began in a Rio de Janeiro classroom still hangs in the air. Not whether students can recite the right words, but whether they can use those words to think. Introduction. Why a broken model persists. Most people who have spent time around modern schooling can sense a contradiction: enormous effort, enormous expense, enormous activity, and surprisingly thin intellectual results. The easy explanation is incompetence. If only teachers were better trained, or administrators more disciplined, or parents more involved, outcomes would rebound. That explanation fails because disappointment keeps recurring under different reforms, different standards, different funding levels, and different political regimes. So the question is not, why do schools sometimes fail? The question is, if the model isn't working, why does it persist? This book's answer is not a conspiracy theory. It is more ordinary and more powerful. Systems persist when they have built-in forces that keep them moving and keep them growing even when they no longer serve their stated purpose. Two physics concepts name those forces: Inertia, why the machine keeps moving. Once a school system is built around age grading, centralized control, credential pipelines, and standardized pacing, reform tends to get poured into the same containers. The container wins. Institutional inertia is the accumulated weight of past decisions. Buildings, schedules, certifications, contracts, textbooks, committees, political expectations, and the quiet assumption that this is simply what school is. When inertia dominates, the system can absorb change, then return to form. Entropy, why more in becomes less out. As systems grow, they tend to convert usable energy into dissipated effort unless actively constrained. To keep this argument concrete across subjects, money will be treated as a proxy for energy. Money is stored human labor, work done, value created, collected as taxes or tuition, and routed through institutions in the hope that it will emerge as the education of a child. But the larger the bureaucracy becomes, the more layers exist between energy input and educational output. More and more of the usable value is dissipated into process, compliance, coordination, reporting, and institutional self-maintenance. The result can be paradoxical. More money fed in at the top, and yet less of the educational value reaching the point that matters most. A teacher guiding a student to form concepts, integrate knowledge, and gain independent control of thought. The structure of this book. First, this book identifies the perpetuators: inertia, misaligned incentives, bureaucratic self-preservation, entropy, and fragmented accountability. Next, it explains why AI, introduced into the same premises, does not automatically rescue education and can easily accelerate the substitution Feynman observed, words and performance standing in for understanding. Finally, it offers glimpses of the escape route, a conceptual approach to education, guarded by virtues that function as internal controls, especially when powerful tools make shortcuts easy and faked competence tempting. The goal is not to leave you angry at a system. The goal is to clearly expose the machine, so you can stop expecting it to do what it was not built to do and start building, or choosing, the escape route for our youth.